Carmen, thank you so much for being here. It's so great to meet you and have you be a part of this. To get started, can you just introduce yourself and describe the type of work that you do?
My name is Carmen Winant. I am an artist and a sometimes writer, and I am a professor at Ohio State University, and I am a mother of 2 young sons. In terms of my work, well, I think of myself as a photographer, really. I'm trained as a photographer, maybe a photographer sort of with a lowercase p. I don't make my own photographs anymore, and I haven't for a long time. So my practice is really invested in seeking out found images that circulate in the world and often sort of circulate in the world in some political capacity, and creating new contexts for them, or sort of aggregating them in installations or books. And the agenda is really a feminist one. I was telling someone the other day that I really think of my work as sort of the channel for my feminism, and not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. I've seen images and a few videos of your studio in Ohio, and it seems incredible, full of stacks of books and photographs and papers in various piles and forms of assembly and organization. I wondered what kind of strategies you use when you get started on a piece. How much of your process is intuition and how much is really premeditated and planned?
Calling it a strategy is generous. I think I spent years really trying to change. I mean, talk about intuition, trying to change the way that I worked, or thinking that an artist should work in a certain way, when in fact, every part of my body was sort of screaming out that I wanted to have images spread out, and have images on the floor, and have images all over the wall, which is in fact how I arrived really at this strategy that I've used quite a lot, of taping images up to the wall, and using blue painter's tape. That was a strategy that was transmuted from the studio, just so I could see all of the pictures at once. Ultimately, I think so much of practice building for all of us, for all artists, is about sort of trusting, our sort of innermost impulses. And I don't necessarily feel, to your question, like that's at odds with strategy. I mean, that is its own sort of kind of, premeditated strategy, if you sort of let it and if you trust it.
Mm. Do you think of yourself as sequencing the work when you're putting it together, or do you kind of characterize collage perhaps as kind of counter to a linear narrative in that way?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the latter, I would say, which is the real promise for me. I remember when I was getting started working this way, and I found this book, like literally found this book by the Soviet filmmaker and theorist Sergei Eisenstein, who made Battleship Potemkin. A lot of people know him from that, but was a really avant-garde, radical experimental filmmaker. But it lent me this idea. He talked a lot in his writing about the idea of creating a kind of filmic explosion. And so I was thinking a lot at the time about how to undo, yes, this idea of narrative, really in some sense, however impossible, also how to undo the problem of composition, which is to say, like, in collage, so often creating something that feels really aesthetic and like moving things around until they look good and then stopping. I really wanted to get around that towards something like feeling. And I felt like composition as an aesthetic tool was really kind of standing in my way. And so Eisenstein, however oblique a reference this might seem, really opened things up for me. I began to think about the possibility of my work as an explosion rather than my work as a composition. I began to think about sort of, these cells coming in contact with each other and creating a different kind of story, than, photographers so often do, and so often have to sort of across linear time. So it's a problem that I'm always wrestling with. It's the most interesting kind of problem. And it's part of the reason that I so often work in installation, is because it enables me, to borrow Eisenstein's words, to sort of explode the problem of narrative sequence.
When I was spending some more time with your work, especially recently, I was thinking about the nature of collage and the way that it sort of is divorced from context, and the way it kind of removes history in some cases, and how there might be a kind of violence that happens with cutting up pictures in order to create something new with those pieces or remnants, perhaps. And I wondered whether you have any kind of tensions or apprehensions around that kind of uh, conflict, or maybe ambivalence around it. And if so, how do you reconcile those issues?
So I never want to shy away from it and say, like, yes, this isn't complicated, or, there isn't some sort of inherent problem in recontextualizing other people's photographs, even if those photographs were intended to live in the world or be disseminated, or, carry with them like a political agenda that I sort of want, to project myself. But yeah, I mean, that feels, how to talk about it. Well, I've never really sort of known how to talk about it, which is why I myself sort of keep coming back to it. It feels, like I said, like the promise of the work, but how to be sensitive and how to be ethical when working in a way that's so inherently complicated. That comes down to sort of project after project in different ways. And there's a couple of ways that I have sort of worked, I wouldn't say through it, but certainly inside of it. So, like, for instance, I'm always working to keep photographs intact. So I'm never sort of cutting into a photograph, or as I think of it, like kind of dismembering the photograph. Like, there's always a kind of wholeness to the photograph, which maybe makes me different than other artists who are working in collage, who are in some sense protecting themselves by making the photograph unrecognizable. I mean, among other things. So, like, it's really important for me to keep the photograph whole. It's also important for me to build relationships through the work. I mean, it sounds sort of trite to say it, but like, that is the work, So in the case of my birth, I mean, the number of relationships that I built with, birth workers, like people who had been midwives for 50 years and delivered like thousands of babies, or in the case of the last project that I did, Notes on Fundamental Joy, which was built out in and around these photographic archives of lesbian feminist separatists in the Pacific Northwest in the 70s, like meeting those women and becoming friends with them and continuing, there's one woman, Carol Newhouse, who has become a dear friend of mine, whose photographs appear in the book, who's become a kind of collaborator. I mean, that is the substance of the work.
Hearing you talk about community too is making me think about a recent exhibition you had at the Fortnight Institute in Brooklyn, called Togethering, which I was able to see, and I absolutely loved the show so much.
Oh, thanks for that.
Yeah, it was so great. And I particularly loved it right now, and being able to go into an art space and see work at all, but particularly to see work that was a lot about examining physical closeness and touching, in this moment where I, along with most of the world, I think is perhaps in a drought of that kind of physical connection and touching. I know that you started this project before the pandemic, but I'm wondering how the sort of eruption of change, of what the pandemic did in terms of shifting the landscape perhaps did to this project, and whether or not you ended up kind of considering it as a perhaps kind of surrogate experience for touching and closeness when you ultimately exhibited it.
It's true that I started it pre-pandemic, and was always thinking about not just sort of bodies touching other bodies, but I was really thinking about this idea of communion in, sort of stripped of its religiosity, this idea that like two bodies actually can become one body, thinking about that in terms of sex, spirituality, for sort of its political capacities, and yeah, just in terms of what it is to sort of be a human being, which of course was amplified and augmented by the pandemic. Now, I live with two small sons who are constantly touching me. So if anything, I was sort of longing for the solitude, but yes, of course, like point taken. Midway through that, as we all know, like the world quaked, and the Black Lives Matter marches began, and the photographs of them from above. I mean, one could feel it when they were inside of it too, but really, like in the photographs, you could see the ways in which the throngs of bodies became one body. And so I started to think about, a project which was so much about sort of intimacy initially, maybe between two bodies, became a project about is maybe too grand a word, but a project that moved through the consideration of many bodies becoming one body, and really like political amplification in that way. So yes to that sort of part of it. I will say to the other part of it, I often think, especially as a former photographer, sort of, more conventional photographer, about that which photographs can't do. And I thought about this quite a lot when I was making my birth, and I certainly thought about it with Togethering too. Taking the first example, after I gave birth myself for the first time and had this really, I felt like, transformative, revelatory experience, I reached for photographs, because that's what I always do, to sort of help me describe back to myself and reiterate this experience that I had just undergone. But this isn't news. Like, photographs can't really do that, right? They can't describe what it feels like to touch somebody else, to push a body out of our body, to experience a range of sensations, sometimes contradictory sensations at the same moment. And that project really crystallized the obvious for me. And so it's always sort of both and the same is the case in Togethering. There's a kind of like reaching towards photographs that depict, right? That like depict this feeling, while at the same time an acknowledgement, at least an implicit acknowledgement, that like they can never really do it, right? Like photographs will always stop short of doing the thing, of describing the thing inside ourselves, like this sensate feeling of being in contact with other bodies, whether it's through sex, or laying with my children, or being or sort of protesting the poison of white supremacy. It's like that you can never quite reach it. And so that, if anything, sort of sustains the practice, how sort of resolvable that is.
And that makes me think too about how you describe your work as really feminist, as decidedly feminist. And I wonder if you could talk about your approach to what photography's relationship is to the kind of world building that is required to feminism, and perhaps kind of like crystallizing a visual for what that is, while also knowing it will never do the work independently.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm so attracted to photography, is because it has that potential and has historically enacted that potential, right, of movement building. In my birth, I was pulling from material that existed, as I said, in the world already to be disseminated, right? I mean, thinking back to like Our Bodies, Ourselves, published in 1971. Well, first in 1970 as a pamphlet, was full of photographs like, this is what it looks like to masturbate. This is what it looks like to get an abortion. This is what it looks like to give birth. This is like what it looks like to have sex, or be entering menopause. Like, what it actually looks like, right, is really important information that women share. They share it through text, and language, and they share it through images, and they both operate sort of together and apart. And so photography has this like incredible political capacity and history that I'm really interested in tapping into and furthering when and where I can. Or same with Notes on Fundamental Joy. I mean, I want to keep this answer relatively short, but I could go on and on. In that project, in this, these separatist communities, like the thing that women, they did a lot of things, but one of the things they did was to teach each other photography, right? To teach each other how to sort of like see the world anew, right? To sort of see and be seen differently and outside of patriarchal constructs in so many ways. And also to create a kind of accounting for what they were doing, as well as sort of using that material to send it out into the world to recruit other women, so the photography was so sort of foundational. And so I am interested in that across my projects. And as we've talked about, thinking about how those photographs that were themselves distributed act as a kind of a residue. So I'm not totally like down on photography. I am interested in like the limits of photography to like contain and project our emotional lives. But in terms of its political potential, like, oh my God, it has been so boundless and so important, as a tool, not just of feminism, but like of social movement building. And that feels like, that is enough to sort of make me want to collect those photographs forever.
What for you determines whether an art book is, or an art piece, I should say, an artwork is or could be feminist?
My variety of feminism, I think some people might qualify as being, of the radical variety. Like I am a kind of, like burn it all down kind of feminist. I am a kind of feminist who does not believe that feminism is compatible with capitalism. So I have, I have my ideas about this that I acknowledge, are not the same. Of course, one of the profound innovations of 21st century feminism is that we acknowledge the myriad of identity positions, and sort of with that comes any number of sort of experiences and ideological ideas. So I just want to say, like, I'm not the president of feminism, like I don't get to decide what makes an artwork feminist or not. I can only speak, in my own sort of for myself and on my own behalf. I think quite a lot, sort of not only about the representational capacity of, of the art object, which is to say, like, what is inside of it, like what history is it pointing to, but the formal strategies that are used and the context, in which the work is being shown. So, in my case, as I've said, like, thinking about how I could sort of explode conventional ideas of how, of how photography lives in the world. Like, can I make something that won't live forever? Can I make something that's impossible to sell? Like who will, if it is being sold, who is it sold to? Like who is it in conversation with? Like all of these decisions, which may seem sort of auxiliary, are political decisions, right? In addition to sort of like, what is the work of?
So to end these interviews, we always like to ask the artists that we're talking to if they could describe 3 things that are bringing them joy right now.
Okay, well, you're talking to me right after the presidential election. So I would say I would be hard pressed not to say that the first thing is, joy, and much of joy is the word as much as relief. That there will be a changing of the guard. I'm going to California in a month. I'm driving to see my family and bringing the children. That won't be so joyful, that car ride. But I haven't seen my parents in almost a year, and so inside of this pandemic, and I live in Ohio, as you said. So maybe that's a piece of joy that I'm anticipating, and driving away from the Midwest winter. My children alternate between being a source of, profound exhaustion and joyfulness. Every once in a while, my son, well, both of my sons, will say like, not just like, I love you, or they'll be really able to articulate it.